The summer of 1815 came to Fenwood House the way the bailiffs had come the winter before, without knocking, and by its second week the whole county had crowded into the great hall to watch a family carried off in pieces. Sun poured through the tall bare windows across the honey-colored stone, and every good thing the Fenwicks had owned stood along the walls with a paper number tied to it. A card on the pianoforte, a card on the clock that had counted 3 generations of Fenwick suppers, a card even on the cold andirons. An auctioneer worked his hammer at a baize desk. Cheerful as a man selling apples to a county that had mostly dined here while Henry Fenwick lived to carve. At the back of the hall, in the one corner the light did not reach, stood a young woman in a dove-gray gown that had been turned once and mended at the cuff, and nobody looked at her, which was precisely how she wished it. The auctioneer lifted a velvet tray into the sun and offered its contents as one lot, sundry, and asked who would start him. Among the tarnished sugar tongs and the odd salt spoon on that tray lay a small gold locket no bigger than a robin's egg, and inside it, though the auctioneer had not troubled to open it, was a painted face with the same gray eyes as the young woman in the corner. A lady called 10 shillings and laughed as she said it, Mrs. Vane, wife to the man who held the deeds now, bidding for the pleasure of it. She raised herself to £1 against nobody and promised to wear the poor dear locket to the assembly, a memento of the Fenwicks. 20 guineas, said a voice from the middle of the room. It was not a loud voice. It had no need to be. Every head turned at once, for the man who had spoken was the Duke of Wrexham, whom the county had assumed present only to price the famous Fenwood Library. Mrs. Vane recovered prettily and offered 5 and 20 in case his grace had taken a fancy to sugar tongs. 50, said the Duke. She came back with 100, her fan gone still. He said 200 as though remarking on the fineness of the day. The hall had gone very quiet, and the auctioneer, who had been about to be witty, thought better of it. Behind his catalogue a squire whispered to know what the man could want with it, and his wife breathed that he wanted nothing with it at all, that they had only to look at his face. Mrs. Vane tried to keep the laugh in her voice and did not manage it, and reminded him it was a 10-shilling locket. 300 guineas, said the Duke, and looked at her, and waited. She did not bid again. No one in 3 counties would have. The auctioneer's little hammer came down as though it had grown heavy in his hand, and in a stammer he gave the lot to his grace. And then the grandest man present did the thing the county would still be arguing over at Christmas. He did not pocket his prize, nor hand it away to his man. He crossed the whole length of the emptied great hall, past the lot-numbered clock, past Mrs. Vane with her bidding hand still half raised, and stopped before the woman in the mended gray gown, and held the little gold locket out to her on his open palm. Miss Fenwick, he said, I believe this belongs to you. She did not move to take it. Her whole life had just been sold over her head in front of the people she had grown up among, and now the finest man in England stood holding out the single piece of it that had been her mother. It had been in the lot, she told him. It had been sold. He had bought it. It was never theirs to sell. He took her hand, turned it until the palm lay open, set the locket in it, and folded her cold fingers over the warm gold. It is only going home. Then the Duke bowed to her. Not a nod, a full bow, from the waist, the bow a man makes to an equal in her own auctioned house before the entire county. He straightened and did not ask for her name, nor her thanks, nor anything at all. He walked out into the sun, the great doors standing open behind him on the bright drive, and the county was left staring at the girl in gray with her fist closed over a locket and no notion in the world what they had just been made to watch. To understand why one blow could strike a whole county dumb, one must first know what that county had spent the spring doing to Clara Fenwick. 2 years before, Fenwood had been a house where the fires were always lit and the door never barred, and Henry Fenwick had trusted the keeping of his accounts to the one man he never thought to watch, his own cousin, Edmund Vane, soft-handed and smiling, who signed his letters as an affectionate kinsman and had kept the Fenwood books 11 years. It was done in ink, quietly, across a single year, bonds bearing Henry Fenwick's seal that Henry had never pressed, a debt to a city money scrivener swollen out of nothing, to a figure no honest harvest could meet, each demand arriving with Vane's sorrowing face behind it. Clara remembered the evening her father spread the papers across the library table and stood over them a long while without a word. He had not signed this, he said at last. He was not a loud man, and he said it as another man might say he could not draw breath, for that was his seal upon it, but it was not his hand. She had begun to answer that they would prove it, that they would find someone who might swear to it, but he looked up, and something behind his eyes had already gone out, and he asked her who in the county would take his word over the word of the man who had kept his books 11 years. No one, as it turned out. Henry Fenwick did not fight it. He signed away what they told him he owed, took to his bed in the new year, and by the thaw he lay in the churchyard, dead of nothing the physician could name but shame. Edmund Vane wore black to the funeral and pressed Clara's hand at the graveside and told her she must think of him now as her protector. She was 27, and she had nothing. The house passed to the creditors, which is to say that, by a road too clever for the county to follow, it passed to Edmund Vane. The furniture was to be sold, and Clara took the only honest place left to a ruined gentlewoman, paid companion to Mrs. Pennington, the vicar's widow at Nethercombe, at £12 a year and her keep. She had thought that the bottom of it. She learned otherwise the morning the auction catalogue was printed, when Mrs. Pennington read out over breakfast the line that named Lot 41, a quantity of small plate and trinkets, sundry, and wondered aloud at such a word for it, and asked whether Clara was quite well. Clara had set down her cup. She knew the thing they meant, and it was not plate at all. It was her mother's locket, kept in a rosewood dressing case the appraisers had sealed up and written down among the sundry trinkets before Clara was let back across the threshold to ask for it. She had asked. She had gone to Edmund Vane with her hat in her hands, for the first time in her life. He had not stopped smiling. She must see how it would look, he had told her, his letting oddments walk out of the inventory before the sale. No, it must all go fairly under the hammer, every teaspoon, and she might bid for it herself, the same as anyone. He knew to the shilling what a companion earned. 10 shillings should carry it, he had said, for sentiment did not fetch much these days. Inside was a miniature of Eleanor Fenwick, painted the year she married, with Clara's own gray eyes looking out of it, pressed into Clara's hands 2 days before she died. It was not property. It was not the estate's. And Vane meant to sell it by the ounce with the sugar tongs and make Clara stand in the crowd to watch. For a man who ruins the father cannot rest while the daughter still keeps one thing untaken. That was why Clara had come back, on the worst morning of her life, to stand at the back of her own great hall, not to save the house, which was lost, but to see how high the one thing she could not bear to lose would be carried. And then a duke she had never spoken to bought her mother back for 300 guineas, folded the gold into her hands, and bowed. A duke cannot do such a thing and have it stay small. By nightfall the story had run to every drawing room in the county, and groan in the running, and Mrs. Vane put it about loudest of all, a piece of quixotic folly. Nothing more, she would say, snapping her fan. And depend upon it, the sly little creature had arranged to be standing just where he could not help but see her. For that sort always did. What none of them could any longer do was leave Clara Fenwick alone. For a year and more she had been the gray shape behind Mrs. Pennington's chair, no one's business at all. In one afternoon the Duke had undone every bit of it. The ladies who had stepped around her at the auction now sent cards to Nethercombe to look at the girl a Duke had bowed to and decide what it meant. At one such table a bold matron put it to her straight out that His Grace had given her a small fortune in gold in front of half the county, and whatever had she done to earn such notice? Nothing whatever, Clara said, and passed the sugar. She had come to think that was the whole of it. The letter came on the fourth day, on paper so thick it stood up by itself. Sealed with a crest Clara knew from the newspapers. It was not an invitation but a summons, in a large impatient hand that had given up on the loops of its own letters halfway across the page. The writer was old, she was bored, and she was told that Miss Fenwick read aloud without simpering, which was more than could be said of anyone her nephew sent to sit with her. Clara was to come Thursday, and to bring nothing. It was signed Augusta, Countess of Harcourt. That Mrs. Pennington breathed was the Duke's own aunt, the Dragon of Harcourt, who had refused to receive 3 bishops. Clara went on the Thursday. The Dowager Countess of Harcourt received her in a morning room full of too much sun, sitting bolt upright in a chair 3 sizes too large for her. A walking stick across her knees she used far more for pointing than for walking. She looked Clara up and down once, as a farmer appraises a horse, announced that she was thinner than her mother ever was, and told her where to sit, not there, for the light would be behind her, and she meant to see the girl's face. Clara sat, and asked whether Lady Harcourt had been acquainted with her mother. She had known Eleanor Chase before ever she was a Fenwick, the old woman said. They had come out the same season, the 2 of them, in 1785, and Eleanor had married rather better than she was advised to, and been a great deal happier than the rest of them put together, which none of them quite forgave her. Then, the sharp old eyes went somewhere far off and came back, and she said they had told her that her nephew paid 300 guineas for a locket at that circus they had made of Fenwood, and handed it to a girl in a grey gown, and she asked whether that had been Clara. It had, said Clara. Then, she was to show it. Clara drew the ribbon from her collar, opened the locket, and laid it in the papery outstretched hand. Lady Harcourt held it to the window, and for a moment the sharpness drained out of her face. There Eleanor was then, she said to the miniature, and not to Clara. She looked a long while, then closed it with a snap and handed it back, and was a dragon once more. The painter had got the mouth wrong, she declared. Eleanor had smiled far more than that. Well then, Miss Fenwick would come on Thursdays and read, and she would not flatter, and above all she would not tell the old woman her nephew was handsome, for every creature who had ever warmed that chair told her the nephew was handsome, and she was sick to the back teeth of it. Could Clara manage as much? I have never once considered whether your nephew is handsome, said Clara. Which was very nearly true, and the first thing she had said in 2 years that made another living person laugh aloud. 2 years, the old woman said, and dabbed at one eye with a knuckle as though it annoyed her. Well, they should make up the arrears. And she told her to sit down properly and read the wickedest thing on the shelf. She came on Thursdays, and soon on Mondays too, for Lady Harcourt found within a fortnight that she could not do without her, and somewhere in the 3rd week the Duke began to call upon his aunt with a regularity the aunt found frankly suspicious. He had not visited her twice in 1 fortnight since he was a boy with a broken arm. She informed him the second time he appeared in her doorway while Clara was mid-chapter. And now here he was, reliable as the milk. He might sit if he meant to loom, and Miss Fenwick was not to stop on his account, for he was nobody. The Duke sat. He did not loom. He heard out the rest of the chapter, some dreadful 3-volume romance his aunt adored and pretended to scorn, and when Clara closed the cover he told her she read it far better than it deserved. That, said Clara, would not be difficult. There, said Lady Harcourt, pointing her stick at her nephew in triumph, the first true word spoken in the room since Lady Day. He was to marry it, or send it away, but not sit there like a portrait of himself. The Duke answered, with great patience, that she would frighten Miss Fenwick clean off, and then who was to finish the dreadful novel? And his aunt declared she would finish it herself and skip to the wedding, as any sensible woman did. There was no wedding in it, he told her. The hero drowned in the 3rd volume. And she pronounced him a fool for reading to the end of a bad book out of duty, and warned Clara never to marry a man who did, for it showed a fatal want of judgment. Clara said gravely that she would bear it in mind, but the dowager had subsided into her tea, and she was smiling into it, and she thought privately that she had not been so well entertained in years. So it went. Clara did not flatter him. She had lost the trick of it somewhere between her father's library table and his grave, and week by week she came to see that this was the whole reason he kept coming. For the Duke was the most hunted man in 3 counties, and very tired of being caught. Everywhere he went, he was told he was clever, told he was generous, told above all and without end that he was handsome, until the words wore as smooth and meaningless as old coins. One hopeful mamma had once breathed across a dinner that he must be so weary of hearing it, but that he was quite the handsomest man in the room, and he had answered that he was the richest man in the room, and found the two very easily confused. And then on a Thursday a companion in a mended gown would tell him his aunt's novel was dreadful, and that he had read some matter of the day entirely wrong, and would want not one single thing from him, and it was, he had begun to think, the only hour in his week that cost him nothing to live through. He did not say so. He was not the sort to say such things aloud. He said them, instead, in pencil. It began with a book. He had heard Clara defend a poet to his aunt, and lose, cheerfully, for want of the volume to quote from, and 3 days later that volume was at Harcourt, left with the footman for Miss Fenwick if she cared for it, 1 line penciled in the margin beside the very stanza she had misremembered. In a hard black hand, you were nearer right than my aunt allowed. She answered the only way the book permitted, and wrote beside the next poem that he was wrong about this one. It came back a week later. The argument carried 3 pages on. In the same hard hand, wrong, was he. Then let her account for the 4th verse, which he doubted she could. She could, and did, in the margin, and sent it back. And so a conversation neither would risk aloud ran quietly on paper for the better part of a month in the white edges of other men's books, weeks before either said a word that mattered in a room with air enough to carry it. He had looked at her the whole chapter that day, Lady Harcourt observed one evening, when the door had shut behind him. Clara said she had been reading, and had not noticed. No, said the dowager, she never did. It was very nearly her most useful quality. One wet afternoon, when his aunt had dozed off over her own novel, the Duke asked Clara the thing no one in 2 years had dared to ask her. They said in the town that her father had had no head for money. Had it been true? She closed the book upon her finger. My father could reckon a tithe barn to the last sheaf in his head. He was ruined by a man who reckoned better, and who was believed because he smiled while he did it. There was a difference, she said, between a fool and a man who has been robbed, though she had yet to meet the neighbor willing to learn it. Tell me his name. He knew the name, she said. Everyone knew it, and it did no good to say aloud, for a tidy hand and a good coat had outfaced better witnesses than a ruined man's daughter. He was not every gentleman, he answered. He dined very seldom, and had never once believed a man who wished to be believed. And when she gave him the name, she countered, he would do what every gentleman in the county had done with it, believe the smiling man over the ruined one, because the smiling man asked him to dinner. So she told him, not weeping, not pleading, only laying it out plainly, one wrong figure after the next, as her father had taught her to set down a column. He did not offer her comfort, which she could not have borne, nor pity, which she would have refused. He heard her to the end, and then was silent a while, like a man who has quietly resolved upon something, and does not mean to trouble a lady with it until it is done. The word that mattered was very nearly said in the garden. Lady Harcourt kept a walled garden she had grown too stiff to walk in, and too proud to give up, and she took to sending the two of them out to report upon the roses, with a look that fooled no one. They walked the gravel slowly, the Duke with his hands behind him, Clara keeping the full width of the path between them. He need not entertain her, she said. His aunt had only sent them out to have her own chair to herself a while. He knew exactly why his aunt had sent them out, he answered, and so, he thought, did she. He had wanted to ask her a thing since May, he went on, watching the roses and not her, and could not ask it without sounding as though he wished to be thanked, which he did not. Then, he was to ask it badly, said Clara. She should not mind. At the auction, he said, you should know I did not come to Fenwood for the library. I came because I had heard, the night before, in a room where such things are laughed over, what Vane's wife meant to do with your mother's locket. And I could not. He stopped. His jaw worked once. I did not buy it for you. I bought it because I. And there, he left it. Whatever the end of that sentence was, he would not set it down between a duke and a woman who could not walk away from him if the words landed wrong, a paid companion in his aunt's garden with nowhere on earth to walk to. So he shut his mouth on the half of it and said, in quite another voice, that his aunt held these to be the wrong sort of rose and meant to have them out in the autumn. They seemed to Clara exactly the right sort. She gave him the escape and did not reach for the end of the sentence, though she carried its broken edge home and lay awake against it a long time. Lady Harcourt had buried a husband and 2 brothers and every illusion she was ever issued, and she saw what was taking shape in her morning room sooner than either of the young fools it was happening to. She meant to say a thing once and never again, she told Clara. She could not abide a matchmaking woman and refused to become one at her age. Her nephew had been wanted for his title since he was 19. Wanted, flattered, hunted the length of England, and not once simply liked, by a soul who stood to gain nothing by the liking. Clara did him that plain courtesy without appearing to know she did it. The old woman had watched her at it. She had known Clara's mother, she said, and Eleanor Chase was the one wholly honest woman of her acquaintance, and it had cost her, and it would cost Clara, for this world cannot forgive being shown up by the plain truth of a thing. So she would tell Clara what she would have told Eleanor if it came, and she had begun to think it might. They would make her pay for it. The whole county would form an orderly line to make her pay. Was Clara the sort that pays and keeps her feet, or the sort that runs? Clara said quietly that she had already lost her father, her home, and her name in front of these people, and could not think there was a great deal left that they could charge her with. The old woman looked at her a long moment, then nodded once, as if a document had been signed and witnessed. "Good," she said. Now Clara was to read to her, something with a wedding in it, for she was in a humor to be disappointed by fiction. The season wore into its heavy green middle, and the temper of the county curdled with it. Ladies who had asked her to tea only to look at her now cut her cleanly in the lane, for it was one thing for a ruined companion to be pitied, and quite another for her to become interesting to the one man the whole county had failed for years to catch. And in a narrow office above the market square, Edmund Vane totted up what a duke's interest in Clara Fenwick might one day cost him, and did not care for the figure he reached. Vane had ruined one Fenwick with a pen, and learned that a pen leaves no blood on the cuff. His difficulty now was precise. While Clara remained a companion at £12 a year. Her father's ruin was a shut ledger no one would trouble to reopen, but a duke does not let his regard settle on a ruined house without his men of business turning over every stone of it, and beneath one of those stones lay a bond in Henry Fenwick's name that Henry had never signed. Ducal attention was a lamp carried into a cellar, and Vane had a great deal to keep in the dark. So he reached, as always, for paper, and on a still afternoon late in the summer, he drove out to Nethercombe, a document in his pocket and his wife's fixed smile now upon his own face. He did not wait to be shown in. He never had. How well the quiet life became her, he said. She was not to send for the widow, for this was a family matter. "Whatever you have come to say, cousin, you may say it standing," said Clara. "You will not be here long enough to want the chair." How hard she had grown, he said. He unfolded his paper, smoothed it on the little table, and turned it so she might see the ruled columns. She would recall how thorough the appraisers had been at Fenwood. Here was the estate inventory, entered and witnessed, and here, did she see the line? One gold locket, chased, a linning within, counted among the heirloom plate of Fenwood and entailed, as every Fenwood heirloom was entailed, upon the holder of the estate. Which was to say, he told her, upon himself. The room had gone very still. That locket had been her mother's, said Clara. She had given it into her own hands upon her deathbed. It was never plate. It was never Fenwood's. It was never his. What a pretty thing to believe, said Vane. His voice did not rise. It never rose. That was the whole horror of the man. But belief was not an inventory, and the inventory said otherwise in a witnessed hand. It was an entailed heirloom, wrongfully carried out of a sealed sale, hanging that moment about her neck on a ribbon. There was a word, he said, for the keeping of property one knew to belong to another. The law called it theft, and a magistrate would call it theft. And Sir Gerald Thorne sat as magistrate at the assembly, on the very night of the county ball. He let that stand in the quiet. He was not a hard man, he went on, the smile returning. Let her give the trinket back into his hand that night, of her own will, and go quietly away to some town where the name of Fenwick had never been heard. And he should find he had no wish to trouble a magistrate over one muddled girl. Or let her keep it, wear it to the assembly, if she pleased, and stand up before the whole county for a thief, and be committed for the sessions. And they would discover together how his Grace's tender interest fared once its object was bound over in irons. She might choose as she liked. He was easy either way. Clara's hand had gone, without her leave, to the small hard shape beneath her collar. You forged the debts that killed my father, she said, very low. And now you have forged a line in an inventory. It is the same trick every time, Edmund. You write a lie down in a tidy hand, then dare the world to call a tidy hand a liar. For an instant, No longer than the fall of the auctioneer's hammer, something that was not amusement moved behind Vane's eyes. Then it was gone. He refolded his paper and rose. "Tonight," he said, "or the assembly." On the whole, he believed he should prefer the assembly, and he would give his regards to the widow. He gave his regards to the widow himself, on his way to the gig, a quiet word on the step, a grave nod, the document produced once more, and whatever he said to Mrs. Pennington had done its work before the supper was cold. The old woman could not lift her eyes from the congealing mutton. She was the poorest creature in Christendom, and she knew it, she said. But she had £40 a year, and the goodwill of the living, and nothing else between her and the workhouse, and she was given to understand that if she kept beneath her roof a woman under charge of theft, the parish would look elsewhere for its comforts, and she would be turned out come Michaelmas. She could not. God forgive her. She had not the courage. Clara must be gone by the end of the week. Clara came round the table and stilled the old woman's shaking hands beneath her own. She was not to weep, Clara told her. She had given her a roof for a year and more when no one else in the county would own her, and Clara would not have her turned out of it on her account. She understood, she added, more quietly, and she did, and did not blame the frightened old woman one grain, which was somehow the worst of it. So the trap stood built and baited, with the tidy neatness of all Vane's work. The magistrate would sit at the assembly. Her place and her keep would be gone by Friday. She might save herself even now by handing her mother's painted face to the cousin who had killed her father by slow degrees, and going away nameless to be no one at all. Or she might keep it, walk into the county ball, and be taken up for a thief before every soul who had once dined at her father's board. And that same night the Kentish family meant to bring out their daughter, Miss Louisa Kentish, £10,000 and a biddable temper, and set her, gowned and glittering, squarely in the Duke's path, that the county might have one wholesome thing to watch while the Fenwick girl was led away. Clara did not hand her mother across a table. She sat up the whole of that night in the narrow room at Nethercombe with the locket open in her palm, weighing the two roads by candle end. One was safe and nameless and went on quietly forever. The other ran straight through the county ball itself and might end in irons. By the grey of morning she had chosen, and it was not the safe road, and she was surprised how little the choosing cost her once it was made. She sent 2 lines to Harcourt, for the Dowager had made her promise to send word the day the reckoning came. It had come, she wrote, and it was Thursday's assembly. She meant to go, and to wear it. The answer came within the hour in the large impatient hand. Clara was not to go in a widow's gig. The carriage would be at her door at 8. She was to wear the grey, and let them see exactly what it was they were choosing to destroy. What Clara did not know was that the Dowager had not been idle since May. Believing the story from the afternoon she first held the miniature to the light, she had sent quietly for old Mr. Alderton, who had never believed that Henry Fenwick could not add a column of figures. Nor was she alone in turning over stones. The afternoon Clara had laid the ruin out plainly in that sunlit morning room. The Duke had set his own men of business upon the Fenwood accounts, to spare no expense and knock upon any door in the city that wanted knocking. Vane had been right to fear the lamp. He had only mistaken the hour it would be lit. The assembly rooms above the Angel had not been so crowded in 20 years. Everyone had come, as everyone comes when there is to be a spectacle, and no one will own to having come for it. The candles blazed until the long room stood bright as noon. The fiddlers tuned, and near the head of the room Miss Louisa Kentish had been arranged in white and silver, £10,000 and all her mother's hopes, precisely in the Duke's path when he arrived. Clara came in at 8 on the arm of the Dowager Countess of Harcourt, in the dove-gray gown, her mother's gold locket plain at her throat. The music did not stop. That happens only in stories, but the talk did, in a spreading ring, as a pond hushes around a dropped stone. Heads up. The pair of us, the old woman murmured, to Clara and to nobody. I have not looked forward to an evening so much since the king was still sensible. Edmund Vane had chosen his ground with a clerk's care. He waited until the room was fullest and the dancing had not quite begun, until every ear was idle, then crossed to where the magistrate stood, Sir Gerald Thorne, a heavy, careful man who disliked assemblies and disliked scenes made at them even more, and pitched his soft voice to carry exactly as far as he wished, and no farther. Sir Gerald, I am sorry to bring business into a ballroom. He was not sorry. But there is a lady in this room, wearing stolen property upon her person as we speak, and I do not think I can, in conscience, stand up to dance while she does. The idle ears had their occupation now. The ring of quiet widened until it had taken in the whole room. This was neither the place, the magistrate said, low and unhappy. But Vane cut in that it was precisely the place, for the property had been stolen from this county, and the county might as well see justice done in it. He drew out his folded paper, and it seemed almost to open itself, so often had it been unfolded, the Fenwood estate inventory, entered and witnessed, item, 1 gold locket, chased. A linning within, listed among the heirloom plate of Fenwood, and entailed upon the holder of the estate, which since his poor cousin's death was himself. It had been carried wrongfully out of a sealed lot. It hung that moment about Miss Fenwick's neck. He made no scene, he said. He merely asked Sir Gerald to do his office. Every eye went to the locket at Clara's throat, then to her face, and waited for it to crumple. It did not crumple. Sir Gerald turned to her heavily, and he was not unkind, which was almost harder to stand than unkindness. She was charged before him, he said, with the keeping of entailed property not her own. It was a grave charge, and he must ask her plainly, would she give up the locket to Mr. Vane, as holder of the Fenwood entail, or would she answer the charge? The room held its breath. I will answer it, said Clara. Her voice was not loud, but the hush was total, and it carried clean to the walls. The locket was my mother's. She had it before ever she was a wife, and it was no part of my father's estate, and she put it into my hands 2 days before she died. It was never Fenwood's. It was never entailed. And it was never Edmund Vane's, however tidy the hand he writes that lie in. Sentiment, said Vane gently to the room, and 1 or 2 tittered from old habit before they recalled themselves. A charming little speech, but a speech was not an inventory, Sir Gerald. No, said a new voice, dry as a shut book. It is not. Which is fortunate, for I have brought the inventory. Old Mr. Alderton came forward out of the crowd, a flat leather case beneath his arm, and the room turned to him in astonishment, for not a soul had marked him come in, which is how solicitors prefer it. He had acted for Henry Fenwick 30 years, he told Sir Gerald, and he would trouble him to look at 3 papers in their order. He set the case on a card table and opened it. The first was a single-aged sheet, the last will of Eleanor Fenwick, born Eleanor Chase, proved in the diocese in the autumn of 1808, and he read out the one bequest that signified that to her daughter Clara she gave her gold locket with her own likeness painted within, being her own property before her marriage, and no part whatever of her husband's estate, that she might keep her mother near her. He looked up over his spectacles. her own property before her marriage, no part of her husband's estate. A woman could not bequeath what was entailed, he said, and no court in England had ever entailed a woman's own locket upon a male cousin. It had been hers to give. She had given it to her daughter. That was the first paper. The tittering had stopped altogether. A will proved only what a fond and dying mother wished to be true, said Vane. But a thread had come into the soft voice that was not there before, and the estate inventory told another tale. Ah, said Alderton. The estate inventory. The second paper. He drew it out, the true inventory of Fenwood, taken in the spring of 1812, in Henry Fenwick's own hand, for he had stood by him at his library table while he wrote it and witnessed it below. Every article of plate in that house was set down in it, and he invited Sir Gerald to search it top to bottom for one gold locket among the Fenwood plate. He waited. Sir Gerald would not find it, for it was not there, because every soul at Fenwood then had known that locket to be Mrs. Fenwick's own, precisely as her will declared. And now he laid the two inventories side by side, Henry's true one and the paper Vane had brought, and asked the magistrate to look at the one line that troubled them, at the ink of it, and at the hand. It was a later line, in a later ink, in a hand that was not Henry Fenwick's, crowded into a space too narrow to hold it honestly. One of them had been written by a gentleman in the spring of the year 12. The other had been added to by somebody a great deal more recently, and a great deal less carefully than he supposed. Sir Gerald bent over the two papers a long time. When he straightened, his heavy face had changed, and he did not look at Clara any longer. Mr. Vane, how do you account for this line? Copyists, said Vane, and for the first time the soft voice hurried a little. Appraisers, a clerk's edition, an honest slip in the copying. Sir Gerald would not hang a line of stray ink upon a gentleman of this county on the word of one old country attorney and a sentimental girl in a borrowed carriage. I have hanged nothing yet, Mr. Vane, said Sir Gerald heavily. I asked you one question, and you have given me 3 answers to it, which is 2 more than an honest man requires. No, said Alderton, but you may commit him for the 3rd paper. And the room, which had believed itself as quiet as it could go, went quieter still. He had not come by the 3rd paper himself, said Alderton. He was too old, and by far too poor, to have come by it. It had been got for him, within the last fortnight, by gentlemen with a good deal longer reach than his. He did not glance toward the door, where the Duke had come in unremarked some minutes before, and now stood with his hat still in his hand. It was the day ledger of Mr. Sowerby, the money scrivener of Lombard Street, whose demands upon Henry Fenwick in the year 13 had been the ruin of him, and driven him to his grave. He would read but one column. On the 9th of March, a loan of £800 advanced to Henry Fenwick, gentlemen, and on the 10th of March, the very next line, in Mr. Sowerby's own hand, that same £800 paid over in full, not to Henry Fenwick, who never saw 1 shilling of it, but to Mr. Edmund Vane, agent. He turned the page. There it stood again in May, and again in September. Every debt that had broken Henry Fenwick was a loan Henry had never sought and never received, got up in his name and paid straight into the pocket of the cousin who kept his books. He did not die for want of arithmetic, Sir Gerald, said Alderton. He was robbed to death by a patient man, and then that same patient man drove out to rob his daughter of the last gold thing her mother left her, and to name her the thief while he did it. Nobody laughed now. The county that had crowded into Fenwood in June to pick over the linens of a fool stood in the blazing candlelight and understood, all at once, that it had spent 2 years laughing at a murdered man. Edmund Vane looked once at the door, once at the 2 inventories upon the table, once at the ledger open in Alderton's hand, and the smile that had not left his face through the ruin of an entire family finally, quietly, went out of it. His wife's voice came thin and high across the hushed room, begging him to tell them it was a lie, to tell them anything at all. But Edmund Vane said nothing whatever, which was, in the end, the one true thing he ever told the county. The magistrate's voice filled the room now. He had lost all his distaste for scenes. "Mr. Vane would not leave this county tonight," he said. He would give his word to attend him in the morning, with every paper he possessed, or he would give him his wrists and attend him now in the lockup. He was to choose. Then Sir Gerald turned from Vane as a man turns from something gone bad, and bowed, stiffly, to Clara. There was no charge, he told her. There had never been any charge. She was to wear her mother's locket in good health, and to accept, if she would have it, the apology of a foolish old man who had very nearly done a wicked thing that night in the name of the law. "You did not do it," said Clara. "That is the part that signifies." It was then, into the ringing quiet that comes after a thing that cannot be taken back, that the Duke crossed the room. He crossed it as he had crossed the great hall at Fenwood, without hurry, past the Kentish party in their white and silver, past Mrs. Vane, who had let go of her husband's arm, and stopped before Clara, and this time the whole county already knew her name. "In his aunt's garden, in June," he said, plainly, and let it be heard to the walls. He had begun a sentence and could not finish it, and he had carried the end of it about ever since, like a stone in his shoe. Would she let him finish it now, in front of everyone, since everyone was already listening so very hard? "That seems only fair to your shoe," said Clara, and somewhere behind her the old countess barked once with laughter into the hush. "I did not buy it for you," the Duke said. "That is the thing I could not say." He had bought her mother's locket back, he told the room, neither to make her grateful to him nor to shame them, though he owned he no longer minded that they were ashamed. He had bought it because he had stood in that hall and watched the whole world take everything she had and laugh while it took it, and he could not let them have it. And he had not had one easy hour since in which he did not know that a man who cannot bear to let them keep a locket ought, in common honesty, to confess that what he truly could not bear was to let them have her. He did not kneel. He was no man for kneeling, and she was not, after this night of all nights, a woman who needed a great man upon his knees to be sure of her own worth. He only held out his hand, palm up and open, as he had held it out to her once before, with a locket lying on it. "I have wanted for nothing my whole life, Clara Fenwick," said the Duke of Wrexham, "except the one thing no title could ever fetch me. A person who wanted nothing of me in return. Marry me. You will be the first duchess in the history of this county chosen for her plainness, and I intend to be perfectly insufferable about it." Clara looked at the open hand, then at the man, in front of the county that had auctioned her mother and tried to jail her for keeping her, and she performed nothing for them at all. She put her hand into his, as one sets down a thing carried too far and too long. "Yes," she said, "only that." And it was enough, and it was witnessed by every soul in the room. He drew her in by the hand he held and kissed her once, unhurried, in the blazing candlelight, before the whole county, and the fiddlers, forgotten this half hour, struck up absurdly a wedding tune, and the brightest room in the county was made at last to watch its greatest man treat the girl in the gray gown as the only person of any consequence in it. A year is a long while in a story, and no time at all in a life. And both of those things were true at Fenwood the following summer. The honey-colored house stood open to the morning again, its windows bare of paper numbers, its great hall swept clean of everything but light. Edmund Vane was gone, not to the churchyard, for the law is slower than that, but abroad, to some warm country that asks few questions of a man arriving with a portmanteau of ready money and a great deal to keep quiet. And Fenwood, once his frauds unraveled the whole cloth of his claim to it, had come back into hands that loved it. The fires were lit again, and the door was not barred. Clara stood at the tall window of the great hall, where she had once been pressed into a corner the light could not reach, and the light reached her now from 3 sides at once. She wore a gown of deep summer green, a color she had chosen for herself, to the frank astonishment of the modiste, and at the throat of it, plain against the green, hung the little gold locket with her mother's face inside. Above her a door opened and shut. Her husband was arguing cheerfully with old Alderton over the replanting of the wrong sort of rose. And in a drawer upstairs, folded away in paper and lavender and not thrown out, for there are things one keeps only to remember by, lay a dove-gray gown, turned once and mended at the cuff. She had taken no revenge. She had been offered a dozen kinds and wanted none. The people who had bid upon her ruin now bowed to her in the lane, and she returned the bows civilly and thought no more of it than that, which they found far more unanswerable than any revenge could have been. She had her mother at her throat, her father's good name restored in the very mouths that had helped break it. A house full of light, and a man who had crossed 2 crowded rooms before the whole world to stand beside the plainest woman in 3 counties. The auctioneer's hammer had come down once in this hall and sold a family to pieces. A year along, on a bright morning, it seemed a very long way off, and a very small sound, against all the living still to be done in the rooms it had emptied. And the locket, carried down to sundry trinkets, up to 300 guineas, and very nearly into a magistrate's evidence box, had come, in the end, only home, which was all the Duke had ever said it was doing.